Welcome to another episode of China Update, where I provide you with the most up-to-date political, economic, and geostrategic analysis on the world's number 2 economy. My name is Tony. Let's jump in. Okay, happy Saturday everybody. I trust you're having a restful weekend. We begin today's video with US-China developments and specifically official statements from Washington on hacking risks, one of the several fronts in ongoing competition between the two powers. This week, the US announced the disruption of a botnet used to hack critical infrastructure. The United States Department of Justice, in an official statement, said that the hackers, known to the private sector as Volt Typhoon, used privately owned Soho routers infected with the KV botnet malware to conceal the PRC origin of further hacking activities directed against the US and other foreign victims. These further hacking activities included a campaign targeting critical infrastructure organizations in the United States. Meanwhile, several officials testified to Congress about PRC hacking activities this week, with FBI Director Christopher Wray expressing, quote, "China's hackers are targeting American civilian critical infrastructure, pre-positioning to cause real-world harm to American citizens and communities in the event of conflict." End quote. He added that China's intent is to sow confusion, sap the United States' will to fight, and hamper the American military from deploying resources if the dispute over Taiwan escalates into a war. U.S. financial media outlet The Wall Street Journal, reporting on this week, wrote, quote, "Western intelligence officials say its skill and sophistication has accelerated over the past decade. Officials have grown particularly alarmed at Beijing's interest in infiltrating U.S. critical infrastructure networks, which they say poses an unrivaled cybersecurity challenge." End quote. Veteran China analyst Bill Bishop noted on these developments, quote, "The messaging from the US government is growing increasingly sharp as I think they are trying to tell the PRC government to back down from some of the things they are doing. So far, to no avail." End quote. Of course, China denies all of this, with PRC Foreign Ministry spokesperson Wang Wenbin expressing that China firmly opposes all forms of cyber attacks and cracks down on such practices in accordance with the law. Adding, quote, "The United States jumped to an unwarranted conclusion in the absence of valid evidence, and it has slandered and made groundless accusations against China. The United States itself is the origin and the biggest perpetrator of cyber attacks." End quote. Next up, China has long been a prized market for US technology giant Apple, generating roughly a fifth of its global sales and acting as a key base for manufacturing for its iPhone and other products. However, according to its latest quarterly results, revenue from the region plunged 13% last quarter, marking the worst decline since the 2018 holiday season and spooking investors. Apple's China struggles contrasted with an overall revenue gain of 2.1% to $119.6 billion US. Analysts had predicted an increase of 1% on average. Apple's China story has been cracking in recent months. We remember that Beijing informally imposed stricter bans on the use of foreign technology in the workplace, and Huawei has been giving Apple a run for its money domestically. Last month, Apple began offering discounts of as much as 500 yuan, $70 US, on the iPhone 15 to compete with Huawei's Mate 60 Pro phone. On a conference call with analysts on Thursday, executives said that faith in China wasn't shaken, with Chief Executive Officer Tim Cook expressing, quote, "I remain very optimistic about China over the long term." End quote. Apple's Chief Financial Officer expressed, quote, "We are not happy with the decline, but we know China is the most competitive market in the world." End quote. The markets were initially quite taken aback by the quarterly reports, however, plunging over 5% in trading on Friday morning before clawing back some of the ground lost. Gene Munster, Deepwater Asset Management co-founder and managing partner, speaking to media on Friday, expressed, quote, "I still think China is a big opportunity for Apple. I think this storm will pass." End quote. Now, speaking of stocks and storms, it's been another very painful week for China equities, ending with a manic Friday as shares swung sharply in the final hours of trading before closing at a 5-year low. we look at this next. But just quickly, if you're enjoying today's video or getting some value from it, I have a huge favor to ask, and that is to like and subscribe. This is only 2 clicks of the mouse, but it is a huge help for me, and it's the best way, along with sharing the video, of course, to help the channel grow. And for those who want to help keep the channel financially sustainable, Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee links are in the description below. The channel relies primarily on subscribers to keep going. Thank you so much, everybody, for the ongoing support. Let's continue. The CSI 300 index plunged more than 3% at one point on Friday before closing down 1.2%, ending the week with a 4.6% loss, its biggest since 2022. The index was down 7% year to date. The Shanghai Composite Index lost 6.2% in its worst week since 2018. The Shenzhen Component Index shed 8.1%, its largest drop in 3 years. The indexes have lost more than 8% and 15% respectively since the start of the year. Of course, we all know the world got the Evergrande liquidation news on Monday, a reminder that the property crisis rages on. Wednesday saw poor manufacturing data, and the general feeling still feels bearish. Quote, "As a person who was bullish throughout the year, even I am feeling the panic and starting to turn gloomy. Judging by the trading trajectory, the free fall we saw this Friday afternoon indicates forced selling, and I fear that this would trigger a downward spiral, causing more margin calls." End quote. US outlet Bloomberg writes today that the outstanding amount of margin debt slid to 1.49 trillion yuan, $208 billion as of Thursday. Quote, "That puts it on track for the biggest weekly decline since April 2022, when the onshore benchmark fell nearly 5% in a single day." End quote. Adding concern that equity indexes have fallen to levels that trigger losses for popular snowball derivatives has also investors on edge in recent weeks. Traders attributed the quick pairing on Friday to likely intervention by state funds. Shin Mang, director at investment bank Chansun & Co., observed, quote, "State funds bought shares when the index fell sharply to below 2,700 in the afternoon trading. The plunge forced the state funds to intervene to stabilize the market." End quote. With almost $6.5 trillion wiped out since 2021, we will continue to follow this space closely as it develops. And we end part 2 with this observation made yesterday by Li Xuetong, fund manager at Shenzhen Enjoy Investment Management Co. Quote, "I don't recall there being this much panic in the market since 2015. Though the sell-off isn't as hard as it was back then, sentiment is just as depressed and in distress." End quote. Okay, next up we end today's video with New Zealand. On Thursday, New Zealand's Foreign Minister, Winston Peters, who also acts as the Deputy Prime Minister, and the Defence Minister, Judith Collins, travelled to Melbourne, Australia to meet with their Australian counterparts, Penny Wong and Richard Marles, for the inaugural 2+2 Australia and New Zealand Foreign and Defence Ministers meeting. Full disclosure, for those viewers who do not know, I am a New Zealander. Much was discussed during the talks, but for our purposes here on China Update, we note that Wellington is using the opportunity to express interest in joining the non-nuclear pillar of Aukus, citing concern around China's growing presence in the Pacific. Aukus is a tight security partnership between Australia, the UK, and the United States, prompted by China's growing influence in the region, centered on the Australian Navy receiving nuclear-powered submarines. The so-called second pillar of Aukus covers the sharing of advanced military technologies, including quantum computing and artificial intelligence. It is this pillar which New Zealand expressed interest in. New Zealand Foreign Minister Peters said that rising to the challenge in the current global climate is, quote, "of far greater importance than it's ever been in the lifetime of anybody in this room," end quote. Speaking to Australian media the same day, Peters said that there has been a vacuum formed in the South Pacific, neglected by traditional actors, and that a, quote, "external interest," end quote, has entered the picture, without mentioning China by name. Historically, New Zealand, a small, highly trade-dependent nation, has taken a less adversarial approach towards China compared to its Anglophone Five Eyes security partners, the United States, the UK, Canada and Australia, but in recent years has become somewhat more outspoken, especially on Xinjiang, Hong Kong and regional security issues. When asked whether joining the security partnership would undermine New Zealand's relationship with China, its biggest trading partner, Peters expressed, quote, "China is a country that practices something which I have a lot of time for. They practice their national interest, and that's what we're doing too." End quote. China has called Aukus a Cold War-era pact that would be dangerous for the region. This sentiment was echoed yesterday, Friday, when the PRC embassy in Wellington expressed, quote, "Like all peace-loving countries, China has serious concerns over Aukus," end quote, adding, quote, "It will not make either the relevant parties or the wider region more secure. On the contrary, it will undermine peace and stability, sow division and confrontation in the region, and thus runs against the common interests of regional countries pursuing peace, stability, and common security." End quote. In a special editorial the same day, the state-run China Daily warned Wellington, quote, "Whatever role New Zealand is being solicited to play in joining Aukus, it would no doubt cast a shadow on bilateral ties and even offset what has been achieved in advancing bilateral cooperation." End quote. Okay, that is today's episode of China Update. Thank you very much, everybody, for watching. There may be an extra episode tomorrow on Sunday. There are still developments we need to cover from this week, so I will either see you tomorrow or on Monday.